Montgomery Community Media presents Small Business Network, brought to you by M&T Bank. SBN is also sponsored by Montgomery County Economic Development Corporation and Leadership Montgomery.
Hello and welcome to Small Business Network, brought to you by M&T Bank. My name is Kelly Leonard. Every month we bring the business community together to network, to collaborate, and to share best practices in an effort to stimulate regional economic development. Thank you for joining us on the live stream, as well as here in the television studio. Today's discussion will focus on hiring and firing in the MeToo era. And I've got a dynamic panel to engage in this discussion. And before we hop into our topic, I want to just give you quick introductions. First up is Erin Allen. Erin is the president of Contemporaries, Inc., the family business she was raised in. Her company helps individuals attain their career goals and clients to find key talent integral to the growth of their businesses. Welcome, Erin.
Thank you.
Next up, we have Meredith, aka Mary Campbell. She is with Shulman Rogers and serves as a business advisor to clients who look to her for counsel on managing their most important asset, their employees. Mary helps clients to resolve workplace-related issues while helping them to maintain a positive and productive environment. Welcome, Mary. And last up, we have Jody Friend. She is a certified human resources executive with over 30 years of experience. As the founder of JLM HR Consulting, Jody's passion is providing HR solutions for her clients by helping them to build their HR infrastructure. Welcome, ladies.
Thank you.
So let's just hop right into it. There's so much buzz in the marketplace and, hashtag MeToo. I mean, that hashtag is trending and it seems like every day something else is bubbling up. And so as business owners and business professionals, I'll just start with Jody. Is there sensitivity training and is it helpful and is it necessary?
Absolutely, there's sensitivity training. It's helpful and it's necessary, especially in today's environment of MeToo. And it's important that companies recognize that they need to provide this training to their employees. It's also what we consider to be one of your first lines of defense, if you will. And certainly Mary, as a legal professional, can talk about how important the training is for your staff.
If I could just add on, in addition to being the right thing to do to make sure that your employees understand that you take these issues really seriously, that it matters, it also is in some places becoming legally mandated, and guess what? That wave is coming. So already in New York, you have to provide this training. DC just passed a law, tipped employees must receive this training. But beyond that, the EEOC recently came out with some guidance about a year ago that said as a best practice, you need to provide this training, and that it should be, and most of these laws are requiring that it be interactive, meaning that you have the opportunity to ask questions. A lot of times it's like a website and you just press the space bar, and we all know what we do when we have a website and we're just pressing the space bar. But it is becoming legally mandated because it is important that your employees receive this message, not because you're worried about a lawsuit, but because you're worried about protecting yourself before a problem becomes a tragedy. These trainings give a real opportunity for people to understand not just what the rules are, but a way to voice their concern when it's just a little concern, a problem, before it blows up and becomes a tragedy for your organization.
Now and let's just camp out there for a minute, because you mentioned the training, and a lot of times it's becoming a requirement for small business in particular, because if I'm a big company, of course I have the money to be able to resource something like that. But are there specific small business implications that entrepreneurs, small businesses should be considering? Because oftentimes we think of, oh, that's just the big guys, that would never happen to me. So have you seen anything, Mary, in terms of on the legal side, the implications for a small business?
Yeah, as soon as you have more than one employee, you're vulnerable to these lawsuits. So again, I always, I give you the scary story. You could be in front of a jury and you could be facing this lawsuit, but let's start with the more important story, which is you want to set up framework for your employees where everybody feels comfortable and you're focusing on the mission's organization or the organization's mission rather than squabbles between employees. So if we set the right tone, and that right tone is first of all making sure everybody understands what's expected, what the concerns are, and then how to voice that concern. We provide that training. When we talk about how to speak up, whether you need to speak directly to the person you're accusing of bad acting, are there other avenues, and then what the employer should be doing in response. Just because somebody has a concern doesn't necessarily mean it's an EEO violation, but let's look into it. Let's address this concern before it becomes a tragedy.
And additionally, to kind of jump onto that, as important as it is to train your employees, it's also super critical that you're training your managers. Because it's one thing if your employee knows that they need to report. If your managers don't know how to deal with it when something comes up, that's really more critical than anything, honestly. Because if they kind of go down the wrong path, it can really be catastrophic for your company.
So Mary mentioned speaking up, and so that's what started all of this, right? People speaking up. And so from what you've seen, Erin, and by and large, let's face it, it's been primarily women that have been speaking up.
Right.
Has the result inadvertently, exposed, or has it negatively affected women in the workplace?
You know, it can, certainly. There's an interesting study that the University of Missouri put out, and they studied the effectiveness of, not only sexual harassment training, but sensitivity training and so on. And specifically as it relates to sexual harassment training, they found that people that were going through these trainings sometimes came out more confused than they were beforehand, not knowing exactly what was considered harassment and what wasn't. And more concerning is that several of the men that came out of these trainings quite often were feeling that their female counterparts were weak or even less competent, which is exactly the opposite of what we're looking for. So it says to me that we should be very careful about the kinds of training that we are bringing into our organizations and making sure that it's clear and concise and that you're working with a very reputable organization that is experienced in doing this training. I know that Jody's organization does a lot of training like this.
Right.
So.
Absolutely, yeah. And so that's what when Mary mentioned earlier, it's very important to have interactive training so that you can provide examples to your employees of what is acceptable behavior and what is unacceptable behavior. Again, to help clarify and clear up some of that confusion that employees may have. If they're on just doing an online training, they may not understand what that means. So if you have someone to come into your organization to provide that in-person training and to make it interactive, give specific examples about appropriate behavior and inappropriate behavior, that will go a long way.
Now, should a company, back to this male-female thing, should the company react differently if a female is accused as opposed to a male, or is everyone sort of treated equally?
Everyone should be treated equally. It was interesting, I was reading the other day that the EEOC has, last year, 17% of their claims were from men. So women can be bad actors just as much as men are. I don't know that it's communicated as often, but it's obviously happening. So yeah, no, everyone should be treated fairly. That's sort of the whole point of the MeToo movement, right?
Right. So we talked a bit about sort of the employees being made aware of this, the policy and what's considered appropriate and inappropriate behavior. But what about, Jody, our vendors and suppliers? Like, at what point, because a lot of employees are interacting with those folks as well, so how do we discuss our policies with our clients and vendors?
So absolutely, anyone that comes into your organization that interacts with your employees, you need to educate your employees again about your specific company policies in terms of sexual harassment, or what to do if you feel like you're being harassed in any way in the workplace. And that could be from outside vendors as well. And so again, educating your staff first about what to do and when to report those types of situations will go a long way. Certainly, companies are required and should take action if it's reported that an outside vendor or visitor harassed, one of their employees. And so, while if you're doing business with other, say you're partnering with a third party, for your business, you can certainly make that a requirement that they be aware of your company's harassment policies. But certainly you need to take action anytime something like that, takes place.
And we actually have, as you can imagine, we're a staffing firm, and our employees are going out there not working in our offices. So actually, as a part of the contract that all of our clients sign, it very clearly spells out what our harassment policies are, and for our employees, it spells out what they should be doing. So it's really critical that you have that in your contracts. And I know that Mary's organization can help with that. She has experience here.
Yeah, from the legal perspective, when you're dealing with vendor and business contracts, you can put it in the contract. But as I'm sure everybody on the stage knows, probably the hardest thing to deal with is when you've got a customer who's harassing your employees. And that's where, unless you have a seasoned HR team, you're going to want to turn to someone like Jody, who's got the staff and the experience to understand how to deal with these very sensitive issues, or your legal advisor, to make sure, because that is a real misstep, a real opportunity for problems when you've got a customer who is putting one of your employees in a difficult situation.
So I'm just thinking about this entire ecosystem now. So because you bring up a really unique perspective, Erin, in terms of you've got staff that you're placing in an organization. So while you may have a harassment policy, do you always know when you send someone in that the organizations that they're working for also have a harassment policy? So is that a part of, okay, in order for us to source your need, you're going to need to have a policy as well? Is that how that works?
Well, we have, it's called EPLI. And that, right, thank you.
EPLI.
EPLI.
Employment Practices Liability Insurance.
Thank you. That right, and so that covers third parties.
Okay.
So from an insurance standpoint, that's helpful there. But as a part of our due diligence with working with our clients, we do, talk to them and review their handbooks and things like that, so that we're sure that, we're all working on the same page. That, we're kind of coming at it from the same direction that our clients are as well.
And from our perspective, EPLI insurance is an opportunity for small businesses. You should consider it. It's not always the best move. You are sort of required to use insurance attorneys. I know I'm sounding like I'm self-advocating, but there are some problems there. So you just want to make sure you're going in with an experienced understanding. You want to ask your broker some real questions about it. But the bigger point, I think, from what Kelly was explaining, is make sure you're partnering with staffing companies and other organizations that are seasoned, that know what they're doing and take their responsibilities seriously. She's not doing all this stuff because it's the right thing to do. I think that's part of it. But she's also a business owner, and business owners have to take these things seriously, because guess what? When she sends employees into your company, you two become joint employers. And she can be just as responsible as the other company, depending on the circumstances. So she wants to make sure that she's dealing with employers that take the stuff seriously. And as a business, you want to make sure that you're dealing with vendors that take these issues very seriously.
So Mary, I was actually going to ask you, is there insurance that companies should purchase? Is that the EP?
That is the EPLI insurance, which is certainly an option you should consider.
Okay. Now, what about Jody? As we're educating our employees, of course, we've got training and make it interactive, all those good things, but I know each of you maybe alluded to handbooks. Is this probably a good time to update the handbook and all that good stuff? What does that look like? What have you seen, some of the trends there?
Absolutely. You should be reviewing, if you have an employee handbook. If you haven't, first let me just take a step back. If you have employees, I recommend that you have an employee handbook. So that's first and foremost. And at least once a year, maybe once every 2 years max, you should be reviewing your employee handbook. And again, if you're not, if you're a very small company, you're looking for, you may not be aware of all of the laws and trends. You can certainly contact, someone like myself or your legal representative to help you. But your handbooks, if you have a handbook, a sexual harassment policy that's clearly defined, that spells out exactly what employees should do, that provides the definitions of what is and what is sexual harassment. Very detailed policy is required to be in your handbook. So again, that's something that you want to be taking a look at. And if you work in if you have employees that live and work in other states, it's also now important for you to take a look at the state laws to see what may be in place that you may be required to comply with. So it's very important to do that on a regular basis.
And from the legal perspective, a bad thing is to not have a handbook. A worse thing is to have a handbook that actually is contradictory to the law. So sometimes Google puts stuff out and it might even be legal in one state. As Jody mentioned, different states have different laws. You do want to make sure that if you're going to have a document, and that's the kind of document that does show up in lawsuits, you just want to make sure that it's done correctly.
And so relative, because here in the DC area, and this, hopefully, excuse my being naive, if I'm based here, let's say in Montgomery County, but I've got employees who live and work in other jurisdictions, what dictates what my sexual harassment policy should look like?
Yeah, so it's typically where you work, but in this DMV area, you might work in multiple jurisdictions, so it does become a little tangled. The good news is from a MeToo perspective, certainly the approach that I take when I'm drafting these policies is a very broad. We're not going to care exactly what the law requires because we don't want to get anywhere near the law. What we want to do is do the right thing by our employees. So it's the differences between the different localities might not matter as much in a discrimination policy, but there's other policies. For just because you mentioned it, in Maryland and Montgomery County and DC each have sick leave laws, paid sick leave laws, and they're different, and you have to comply with all three.
Right.
So there are lots of different ways that the law might matter, but from a Me Too perspective, if you're doing the right thing, if you're treating your employees with civility and respect, you're going to be in compliance with the law.
Gotcha. Were you going to add something?
No, I wholeheartedly agree.
So then what are some of the key issues of hiring and firing employees? Like what are some of the trends that you're seeing?
Well, what's interesting, we talked about this a few weeks ago we got together, and it's interesting, there really aren't a huge number of differences insofar as what you're doing as it relates to the Me Too movement. As long as you're following best practices within hiring, you're fine. Do the right thing at the end of the day. But things to think about are making sure that the person that you're interviewing has a good cultural fit. Having your entire team meet with the person. We call it a 360-degree process of interviewing. So I'm not making any unilateral decisions on who we're hiring. The entire team is meeting with that person. Additionally, making sure that you're doing assessments of the employees as they're coming in, not only in their skills, but also on again, how they're going to fit within your organization. But bringing in a third party here is also a good idea. If you don't have an HR, bringing in an HR consultant is valuable. So, an organization like mine also is valuable because we're going to do a lot of the legwork for you insofar as making sure that the person has all the skills, the background that you're looking for. We're doing all the reference checking and so on to make sure that they're not going to be any red flags insofar as that, and then making sure that they're going to fit, again, culturally. But insofar as firing is concerned, there again, for the most part, best practices are most critical. Making sure that you're following all the laws and that you're documenting everything, making sure that your documentation is appropriate as well. So consulting, again, with a third party is valuable, whether it be your HR department and HR consultant or an attorney is really important there as well. But then the basic things, making sure that there's a third party in the room with you when you're terminating that employee. And then just make sure that you're being clear and concise. But again, those are all things that are very basic to all hiring and firing issues.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're going to open up the floor for questions here. So if you've got questions and you're here in the television studio, you can make your way to the microphone. But Mary, so back to you. After someone, let's say I'm terminating an employee because of a sexual harassment, breach or something along those lines. How should I address that termination, like with the staff? Like, what is it that I should or maybe shouldn't say? So how would I address it with the staff, and then how would I also address it with the accuser?
Yeah, so I think the most important thing is trust but verify, right? So you want to make sure that your employees know that you have their best interests at heart. So when a complaint comes forward, you investigate, you take appropriate actions based on your conclusions in that investigation. And if that appropriate action is a termination, you go ahead and you terminate the employee. When you're talking to the employee, it's going to be pretty clear why you terminated, but it's not enough to just say you're not a good fit. You're not a good fit because you engaged in behaviors that were contradictory to the atmosphere we like to have here, that were contradictory to our employee handbook, whatever the justification is. When you're talking to your staff, trust but verify. They're going to see that you did the right thing proactively by having a great handbook, putting the right people in place, doing your trainings, and then when someone came forward, you took it seriously, you did an investigation, you gathered your information and you made an appropriate decision, and then you take your action. What we don't do is open up the personnel file for everybody in the office so everybody can weigh in. I often kid when I give these trainings that what we don't do is line up in the hallway with our stones so we can throw it at that person. That's not the purpose. The purpose is to prevent the problem from becoming the tragedy. So we ask our employees to trust but verify. When the terminated employee is no longer here, hopefully the problem is resolved, but everyone should know if it's not, if there's an ongoing concern, door is always open, please let me know.
Gotcha, awesome, thank you. Question?
Hi, yes, my question, first of all, my name is C. Marie Taylor, President of Leadership Montgomery. My question is, for companies who have boards, what kind of trainings should you be doing for the board members as they're interacting with the staff and the general public? Thank you.
Great question, yeah.
You should absolutely be doing the same type of training for your board, especially if they're going to be interacting with your staff. I do recommend that strongly.
In the past year, I've had 2 investigations of board members with allegations of discrimination concerns. And remember, an allegation doesn't necessarily mean there's a problem, but if your board members have been trained, that's certainly helpful.
Hi, I'm Andrea Donathan of Donathan Consulting. I think mostly we think of this situation where an employee is harassing another employee or a manager is harassing an employee. I've actually seen a situation where an employee was harassing a manager. Could you talk about how you would handle that? Because it's less common, I think.
I think the process is the same, really. In the spirit of, we're all on an even plane, there shouldn't be harassment by anyone. So in that situation, obviously the manager should be going to the HR department or to the owner and then reporting the issue and so that it can be investigated and resolved. But I don't think there should be any separate process for, an employee who's harassing a manager.
Agree.
So I want to go back to, Mary, the conversation that we were having around how to address the accuser and all that. How do you go, when you say trust but verify, what does that look like exactly without it seeming like accusatory? And then you find out at the end, oh my gosh, it wasn't really what it was. How do you, what does it look like? What does trust but verify look like? And then how do you begin the process of mending if after all of that due diligence you find out, oh my goodness, yeah, it was just this misunderstanding? Because then I feel like you've almost breached the confidence, or you may have you've damaged the relationship to the point where now maybe the person feels uncomfortable or something along those lines.
Yeah, these are incredibly difficult situations, and usually when the investigation concludes, if there is a finding that there's been no policy violation, no violation of the law, what do you do with that? Because there's some hurt feelings.
Right.
So first of all, I think that you mentioned training managers, so important because from a legal perspective, right, our worst case scenario, the underlying claim of discrimination might be difficult to prove. A claim of retaliation, what's a manager's most basic human instinct? You hurt me, I'm going to hurt you. That is retaliation, right? So you need to make sure your managers know that they can't do that. But by the same perspective, time heals a lot of wounds. So everybody feels very emotionally charged during that investigation, and it is one of the most difficult things for a company to go through for the people who are involved. If it's not done appropriately, it can really blow up. By the same perspective, it gives everyone an opportunity to sort of provide the full context. There's usually 2, if not 20 sides to every story, so there's usually some more information that's going on. If there truly is no violation, maybe there still is an opportunity for some training for, to bring Jody, to provide some training on interpersonal relationships, managerial relationships. It might be that the manager didn't violate the policy, but also isn't communicating the right way. Okay. So there's opportunity there.
So at what point do you bring an investigator in?
So you can either, when you have a concern, you can either use your internal HR person to do the investigation. There are plenty of vendors who do the investigation, or you can bring your legal team in to do the investigation. if you're working with your HR person, you just want to make sure that there's some inherent trust, that the HR person has earned that trust in the organization so that it really is a fair investigation. If you're bringing in a third party, that does send a message, hey, we take this really seriously, we want to get to the bottom of it. So it sometimes is going to just depend on the strategic needs of the investigation and cost.
Right. And also who's involved. Obviously, if your HR department is in some way, there's clearly a conflict of interest there. So that might be clearly a situation where it's valuable to bring in a third party. But I think also when you have someone in the C-suite who's involved, then that's also a good time to probably bring in someone because, again, perception matters. And so making sure that you're bringing in that third party because then they're not accountable to anyone in that C-suite.
Gotcha.
Absolutely.
Good point. Anything to add to that, Jody?
I mean, just from personal experience, when I was in a corporate role in the past, that actually happened. It was one of my staff members accused someone of sexually harassing her, and she was an HR professional. So in that situation, I recused myself and brought in a third party to come in and do the investigation.
Wow. Gotcha. Any other questions? Because if not, I've got more. Okay. Awesome. So, we live in a day and age where mergers and acquisitions are very common as a way of growing our small business. So, are there issues, Mary, or for any of you all, that we should be considering as we merge or acquire a company as it pertains to specifically the whole MeToo movement or policy, things like that?
Yeah, so I think one of the trends that we're starting to see is something called the Weinstein Clause. If anyone is not familiar, so Harvey Weinstein was involved in a lot of inappropriate behavior, and it actually brought the company down. The company has now declared bankruptcy. So one thing that companies are starting to do, I think that that's a broad term, but it's really designed to say, pay attention to what you're buying. If you're acquiring a company, you're going to want to make sure that the business that you're acquiring doesn't have these problems kind of lurking in the background, that you're not buying that liability. And by the same token, if you're looking to be acquired, if you have not appropriately addressed these situations, so you've got these lingering issues, if the purchasing company has the right due diligence and has is looking under the rocks in the right way, they're going to find these issues, and it certainly is going to impact the cost. What the Weinstein Clause does is actually hold some of the purchase price in escrow, so that just in case something lurking shows its ugly head, there's a fund to pay for it.
Wow, gotcha. Well, ladies, this has been awesome. Closing remarks. So, any thoughts, advice, guidance? What one nugget would you share with the folks either online or here in the television studio as it pertains to this issue? Like a must do?
Use common sense.
Common sense isn't common
right,
anymore,
isn't that the
That's a
truth?
challenge.
Right, yeah, right. I would say make sure you have a good team around you. HR professionals and a good legal team is really, really valuable. Just as a sounding board to say, are we doing things the right way, I think is absolutely mission critical.
Gotcha. Mary?
Treat your employees with respect. Make sure that they feel comfortable in the work environment. That doesn't mean that every time they have a concern, it's a concern that is a violation of the handbook or the law, but listen to what they have to say. Think about whether you have any ways to improve your work environment, and think about if there's an opportunity to explain to the employee, we understand that you're upset, but this is, appropriate, and maybe this isn't the right role for you. Make sure you're open to those conversations early on.
Awesome. Jody?
Yeah. Invest in your employees. Invest in training. That would be my one takeaway. It's very important.
Awesome. Well, thank you. Thank you, ladies, so much for your insight, for your wisdom, and thank you for joining us online and here in the television studio. This concludes this episode of the Small Business Network. We look forward to seeing you back next year, 2019. It's going to be amazing. So you want to make sure that you join us for just a continual dialogue around strategies, resources, tips to help you to grow your small business. Thanks for joining us.